Thank you very much for the opportunity to present my work on transition co-design for purposive road freight decarbonisation. My name is Churchman and I am a mature second-year PhD student with the Institute for Transport Studies at the University of Leeds. My previous background is in supply chain and logistics, business strategy and IT. My supervisors are Dr. Thijs Dekker and Professor Julian Annabel. To recap what this audience already knows, trucks and vans account for approximately 8.5% of UK carbon emissions. About 2/3 of this is road freight, as not all van traffic is for the movement of goods. Road freight is often portrayed as a hard-to-abate sector, however it must be abated if net zero carbon is to become a reality. Decarbonisation progress has to date been slow, and there remains no clear consensus on how it will be achieved, in particular for heavy goods vehicles. The numerous technological options for decarbonisation are a mixed blessing. There are many levers that can be pulled, but these can add uncertainty and make it harder for actors to commit to a certain path. Based on the urgency of the climate crisis and the fact that it is emissions over the next 10 to 20 years that will most affect our climate future, the focus of this study is on rapid and radical decarbonisation. While all of these technology solutions have the potential to deliver incremental reductions, I'm sure that this group will agree that not all can deliver both rapid and radical reductions. A formative paper to the thinking behind the study is Churchman et al.'s Integrating Techno-Economic, Socio-Technical and Political Perspectives on National Energy Transitions, a meta-theoretical framework. Although this paper considers national energy transitions, I would argue the framework is equally applicable to road freight decarbonisation. It identifies techno-economic, socio-technical and political perspectives. The techno-economic perspective typically assesses technological and economic consequences or requirements of different solutions or policies and considers factors such as resource supply, demand and infrastructure. Socio-technical research, by contrast, considers how emergent technologies or niches can develop and ultimately displace incumbent systems or regimes. The political dimension considers the role of political institutions, state goals, vested interests, and the interactions between these. The large majority of research into road freight decarbonisation is techno-economic. This is in contrast with significant socio-technical research focused on passenger transport and other consumer-centred sustainability transitions. There is, however, good evidence that socio-technical and political factors are also important to road freight decarbonisation. Prior to starting the PhD, I conducted a study for my MSc dissertation which identified barriers to road freight decarbonisation through semi-structured interviews with 15 senior industry participants. A key finding of this study, and a large part of why I'm here today, is that the majority of opinions expressed focused on socio-technical and political transitions dimensions rather than techno-economic, as defined by Churchman et al. This does not mean that techno-economic factors are unimportant. It is of course essential that solutions work operationally and economically. It was interesting, however, that these were not the most frequently highlighted barriers. For those of you familiar with socio-technical research, you will know that a large proportion of this focuses on innovation systems. A further finding, however, was that this socio-technical aspect was least often identified as a barrier, with regimes and niches and technology diffusion being seen as much more significant. This study therefore focuses on socio-technical and political preconditions for successful road freight decarbonisation. My project considers 4 research questions. The first of these, what are the preconditions for purposive, rapid and radical road freight decarbonisation, was the focus of a systematic literature review conducted during the last year. This presentation summarises the findings of this review, which I hope to submit for publication shortly. The concept of purposive action is central to the framing of the study. It assumes that if decarbonisation is to happen, it will need to be made to do so via deliberate, planned action based on explicit transition choices. Recognising the substantial differences between road freight segments, questions 2 and 3 will focus on a single segment. The segment that has been selected is inbound deliveries to supermarkets and supermarket distribution centres. For this segment, the most critical preconditions and implications for system design and governance will be investigated. Finally, question 4 will consider to what extent the findings from questions 2 and 3 can be extended to other road freight segments. An observation from reviewing socio-technical and political transitions literature is that it is often more retrospective, theoretical, or reflective than purposive. Techno-economic research, by contrast, is more often purposive, as it typically evaluates specific future pathway or policy options. After several iterations, 3 attributes of purposive literature were identified and applied in the systematic literature review. Specific relevance to transition challenges faced by actors, forward-looking applicability, meaning that there is a predictive assessment of factors influencing transition outcomes or pathways, design framing, which means that findings are aligned to tangible transition design choices. Because of the limited socio-technical and political transitions work focused specifically on road freight, papers with relevant insights from wider transport, energy and sustainability transitions literature were also sought. For a paper to be returned, it needed to have at least one each of the listed socio-technical and political transition perspective and transition type terms in the title, abstract or keywords. This gave over 26,000 results, many of which were in non-relevant fields such as medicine and mathematics. When the search was further filtered for papers from relevant journals in the period 2013 to 2022, this number reduced to a more manageable 2,150 results. 4 filters were developed to select relevant papers supporting purposive transition. For filters 1 and 3, inclusion and exclusion keywords were iteratively developed, and during this process, every paper that was provisionally deselected was reviewed to sufficient depth to confirm deselection. If a paper was wrongly deselected, keywords were adjusted to prevent this happening. For filters 2 and 4, all papers not deselected using keyword filters were qualitatively reviewed and either confirmed as selected or assigned a deselection reason code. At the end of this process, which lasted about 5 months in total, 18 papers remained selected. This small proportion of the total reflects the large volume of transitions research that, while important, is not directly relevant to road freight decarbonisation, and the relatively small proportion of remaining papers demonstrating the targeted purposive attributes. As a final check, an additional 1,130 referenced and citing papers of the 18 papers selected were filtered using the same 4 filters, and an additional 2 papers were identified. The fact that this was not a larger number gives some validation, we believe, of the effectiveness of the original scope as search terms. The full content of the 20 selected papers was coded using NVivo software and grounded theory methods, leading to the development of a new conceptual, socio-technical and political transitions model. The qualitative coding of the 20 papers identified 24 distinct insights grouped under 5 headings. Actors include freight operators, freight customers, government departments, transport authorities and local authorities. The term arenas comes from transition management theory. They are the virtual or physical spaces in which actors come together to collaboratively design and govern transitions. Design is the combination of key transition choices that must be made to break carbon lock-in in a complex interdependent system such as road freight. Policy is the mix of instruments applied by authorities at different levels, and politics represents the political context that, although somewhat exogenous to the transition, strongly influences and constrains it. The framework on the last slide, while comprehensively capturing and grouping the 24 insights from the 20 selected papers, is potentially too complex to be useful as a tool for transition actors. As such, it risks not meeting this study's own purposive criteria. This simplified version shows the same connections between the 5 elements and emphasizes arenas, design and policy being endogenous to the transition, a co-design feedback loop linking actors, arenas, design and policy that can either be pro or anti-transition, a political context feedback loop between politics and actors that can also be pro or anti-transition. A number of important insights relevant to road freight decarbonisation emerge. Picking just 3 of these. Road freight decarbonisation outcomes and pathways need to be co-designed by actors and arenas, reflecting path dependency and bounded rationality. Expanding on this, road freight is part of a complex freight system that is tightly linked with manufacturing and retail supply chains. Each actor within the freight system is subject to path dependency, where options available to each are enabled and constrained by the actions of others. Decision makers and policy makers are also subject to bounded rationality, in which, faced with limited information and high uncertainty, familiar choices that are known to be sufficient are chosen over unfamiliar choices that could be optimal. These factors contribute to the powerful lock-in to the existing fossil fuel system. Breaking lock-in requires coordinated actions by multiple actors. This in turn requires co-designed transition outcomes and pathways. And on the second point, policy making is endogenous and integral to co-design. And again, expanding on this, often in literature, policy making is treated as outside or exogenous to the system that is affected by policy. Policy is also often treated as semi-static rather than dynamically influenced by the system it is influencing. The selected literature argues that for sustainability transitions to be successful, policy has to be inside or endogenous to the system it is influencing. This means that policy needs to adapt dynamically to the transition. It also means that policymakers are transition actors that must be part of rather than outside transition arenas. And then finally, the third point highlighted is relevant actor and policy responsibility spans local, regional and national scales and multiple government departments. Operators and shippers operate across local, regional, national and international scales. Equally, relevant policy responsibility is shared by local, regional and national authorities. A purposive transition approach needs to coordinate across these scales. A further conclusion, building on these points, is that if a purposive co-design approach is to be taken, this itself needs to be carefully designed. In summary, three groups of transition preconditions are identified. Firstly, it is necessary to have techno-economically feasible options. Without these, no amount of co-design will achieve rapid and radical decarbonisation. In the case of motive technologies, the assessment of techno-economic feasibility needs to cover the whole well-to-wheel process. It is notable that some studies make comparisons between technologies while only considering part of this chain. Secondly, there needs to be a shared understanding of the design choices that need to be coordinated across multiple actors to overcome carbon lock-in. 5 categories of design choices that may need to be made at a system level have been identified: speed and scale of transition, technology and solution selection, infrastructure financing, transition incentives, and institutional capacity. This may not be an exhaustive list. Thirdly, a politically and socio-technically, or you could say organisationally, feasible co-design framework is required to make these design choices. As there are strong advocates for different choices, there are often large socio-technical and political barriers to making a system-level choice that removes other options from the table. It is therefore necessary to have a carefully designed co-design framework that includes option evaluation and selection processes that are supported by key actors and policymakers. The remainder of the study will focus primarily on 2 and 3. This does not, however, lessen the importance of 1, and in fact, a failure to effectively identify solutions that are techno-economically feasible and able to deliver rapid and radical decarbonisation could itself be seen as a political and socio-technical transitions failure. And finally, these are the references, including the 20 selected papers. I'll be delighted to answer any questions as best as I can. I'd also welcome any suggestions or feedback. If any aspects of this work are of interest and you would like to discuss these further, please get in touch via email or LinkedIn, or let's chat during the rest of the workshop. Thank you very much.